All right. Well, our speaker today, Dr. Dean Hunter, spent 6 years in the United States Marine Corps as a rifleman. He spent 20 years in the United States Air Force as a pilot, and 24 years was spent in the field of education as a college professor, a ski instructor, a football coach, a high school principal, a high school teacher, and a football coach. And before all of that, he was an Eagle Scout. And I think you're going to hear today how all those things were related to that Eagle Scout beginning. His combat experience included time in the Korean War, the Cold War, the Vietnam War. In the Vietnam War, he flew 166 combat missions in a modified T-28D, the fighter version, in Vietnam. We have a T-28 out here on the ramp today, so you will get to see one of those fly. He was listed as one of the highest decorated young officers in the Air Force for heroism in 1965. His decorations include the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross with V Device for Valor, the Bronze Star with the V Device for Valor, 7 air medals, plus 32 other awards and 7 medals. Won't you please welcome our featured speaker today and candidate for Congressional Medal of Honor for a flight that he flew in 1964, Dr. Dean Hunter.
I'm coming through, right? Okay. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Well, thank you for coming. What a beautiful audience out there, my gosh. Several weeks ago, I was invited to speak to the Marines from 29 Palms over here in La Quinta. And I called the first shirt out there before the date, and I said, how many Marines am I going to be speaking to? And he said, oh, somewhere between 40 and 70. I said, okay, I can handle that. Well, I want you to know 950 Marines showed up. And I was flabbergasted. I couldn't believe it. I told him, I said, you know, I haven't been surrounded by that many Marines in 65 years. When I stepped ashore in the second wave of the inshore landing, I said, wow, this is really, I feel really safe tonight. But it was a good program. The title of my talk today is, of course, the title of my book, For the Love of Life and Country. And I think by the time I get through, you'll understand where that title came from. Actually, it came right out of the Boy Scout manual. Being an author is not the easiest thing in the world. There may be some of you out there that are authors. You sure well know how difficult it is sometimes. I mean, what do you do when you get ready to write a book? You've got to come up with the title and all the information that goes in there, and that's not the easiest thing in the world to do. I went to San Diego State in 1953 when I came back from Korea, and of course you have to take entrance exams for that, and I did, of course, and I failed the English entrance exam and wound up having to take bonehead English. Now, I mean, that's the foundation for an author. Fortunately, I married a woman who was an English major, and she saved my life many, many times. Before I get started, I want to explain a little bit why I wrote that book. I have 3 children, very successful, all of them, and 9 marvelous, very successful grandchildren. And I figured they didn't know a lot about me and not too much about my father. On my father's birth certificate, it says he was born somewhere in Sonora County, Texas, in a Conestoga wagon in 1893. He grew up in Tombstone, Arizona, wearing 6 guns on his hips from age 14 to 18. He and his buddy got caught by the sheriff of Cochise County stealing a horse, which was a hanging offense. And the sheriff gave them the option of going to Leavenworth and hang or joining the U.S. Army. So I figured my kids need to know a little bit about their lineage. And that was one of the reasons I wrote the book. As Greg mentioned, I'm a veteran of 3 major wars. 65 years ago, I got involved in my first one as a young Marine rifleman in South Korea, excuse me. As a kid, I was always playing cowboys and Indians, and I always thought of myself as a warrior. I grew up in a little town about 140 miles south of here, Coronado. It was an island when I grew up. Today, it is no longer an island. But it was a great place to grow up. I was kind of one of those all-American high school kids. I lettered in football and basketball. I was a student body vice president, very involved in school. But the choice, of what to do when you graduate today is still the same question it was back then. I mean, there's a lot of confusion out there, and trying to figure out what you're going to do and where you're going to go, etc. And I was no different. There were 32 boys in my graduating class in 1950. 15 of them went to the Naval Academy. That represented success, because Coronado was a Navy town. I couldn't get in because my father was a heavy-duty mechanic, and I didn't have a way to get in. One of my good friends that I played football with stopped me one day. He lived 2 blocks down from me, and he said, "Hey, Dean," he said, "I'm going to the academy in 2 weeks," and he said, "I need somebody to come down and cut my dad's grass and wash his car every Saturday." And I said, "Oh boy, that's money, I'll sure do that." Well, about 3 months later, I met his father, who was a retired brigadier general from the Marine Corps. And he wanted to know what I was going to do when I graduated. And I said, "Well, I couldn't get in college or the academy." And he said, "Well, yes, you can." He said, "There's a Marine Corps Reserve unit in San Diego, the 11th Tank Battalion." And he says, "All you got to do is apply and put in 1 year of weekend warrior duty, apply for Bainbridge Prep in Maryland," and they had a 92% shoe-in. My mother's a minister. I was underage, but they signed for me, so I joined the 11th Tank Battalion. I never went to one meeting. They told me they'd take care of me in summer camp. I said, "Okay." Well, when I graduated, I wound up at the University of California under a football scholarship in Pappy Waldorf's freshman orientation program. And I was there about 10 days, and I got this marvelous telegram from our good President Truman inviting me to go on a world cruise for 17 days to Yokohama. And of course, that's how I got to Korea. Well, let me back that up a little bit. There were 4,300 Marines. The Navy pulled a World War II victory ship out of mothballs in San Diego, and we spent 7 days loading it up. And it was supposed to hold 3,000 Marines, and they put 4,300 on there. I want to stop for a second and tell you about my first significant emotional event. When we boarded that World War II victory ship at North Island, it was kind of like when Johnny Comes Marching Home. There were bands and ticker tape and everything. And as I started to go up the gangplank, my mother ran over and handed me a box of See's candy. Now, I want to tell you, I was really embarrassed. Marines don't eat candy. It's called Pogie Bait. And I thought to myself, well, I'll go up the gangplank and walk across the ship, chuck it in the water, and write her a nice note. I didn't get that opportunity. They sent me right down to the bowels of that ship. And the problem was there was only one mess hall on this ship, since it was so old. And every morning they got us up at 4:30, and we went around this ship until we finally got to the mess hall. And all they had were green eggs and green potatoes. And I got to tell you, the barf on the floor was 2 inches deep, and every time that ship rolled, it'd go one way, splash up, and come back the other. You can imagine this trench. Nobody could eat. And about the 3rd day out, I remembered this box of candy. And it was down in the bowels of this ship, and I thought, well, I'll sneak down there when nobody's around, and I'll have a piece of candy. Sure enough, I did that. Here became my first significant emotional event. I dug that box of candy out of my rucksack, opened it up, and guess what was inside of it? A brand new Colt 45 automatic. Now remember, my mother's a minister, but that weapon saved my life 3 times in Korea, so that was a pretty good way to get started, I guess. In any event, we arrived in Yokohama, and there were about 40 of us that didn't have uniforms, so they marched us up to this Army BX and put us in Army Class A's, pinks and greens from World War II. And they said if we had any rank, we could pencil it on our arms. Well, of course, I had none. I was a private no class. Then they marched us down to a large warehouse, and here's where they gave us our weapons. Everybody else got M1 rifles, but they gave me, because I was a pretty good-sized kid, a BAR, a Browning automatic rifle. Well, I was really excited. My guys, it held 20 rounds. It was fully automatic. There were very few automatic weapons at the beginning of the Korean War. Well, between there and the Incheon landing, they taught me how to field strip it and shoot it. But what they didn't tell me, and this is a kicker, once you touched the trigger in combat, the life expectancy was 7 seconds. So I want you to know, it didn't take me long to get rid of that weapon. But it was a good weapon. After we landed at Incheon, the landing wasn't too bad. The mud was the worst thing of all. They split our battalion. Half of it went about 14 miles north of secure Kimpo airfield there in, I'm having a senior second. Anyway, the Kimpo airfield was up there about 14 miles. MacArthur needed it secured to get supplies in. The other half of the battalion went southeast to K3 Suwon, and I got stuck in that group. And as we were marching along about 10 miles out there, we got caught in a mortar barrage. Now, I had never been in combat. I had no training whatsoever. The only training I had was in the Boy Scouts. When these mortars start falling, believe me, it gets exciting around you. There was a bunker about 20 yards away from me, and I was the first one in it, and I dove through it, and all my buddies said I came out faster than I went in. The reason being, when I went in, I hit nothing but spider webs, and I had more fear of spiders than I did the North Koreans. But we eventually arrived at Suwon. I didn't stay there very long because they moved us, we were moving, we cut off the North Korean supply lines real quick, and we got all the way up to the Yalu River. I got up to Hagaruri, which is a little mountain community about 14 miles from the reservoir, and it was a pretty interesting place to be. The temperature there at that time was 30 to 50 degrees below zero. So it was very, very cold. I was a replacement rifleman for 7th Marines up on the reservoir. And of course, by the 26th of November, the Chinese had entered the war. And suddenly we were surrounded by 120,000 Chinese soldiers. And there was only close to 9,000 Marines in this containment there. It got pretty exciting. One of the problems we had is just trying to stay warm. We had what we called, I should say the Marines had what we called warming tents. And there was about 10 of them in this little compound, and they would allow 7 Marines in for 4 minutes every 4 hours. And then there was a potbelly stove, and you had to get warm as quick as you could. Well, I was standing outside waiting to go in, and these 7 Marines went in, and one of them took a can of pork and beans and put it on the stove and forgot about it. Of course, it blew up, and it was, now this is hilarious. There were 7 Marines coming out of that tent every which way you could imagine, yelling mortars, mortars, and it was really, really kind of fun. I want to just find a quote here. I lost it somewhere in here, but it was from General Fuller, and I'll just, I didn't know, pardon me, he was a colonel then. He was our commander and battalion commander. And I remember him getting up on a box with a megaphone and going around in a circle saying, Marines, Marines, Marines. We are surrounded by 120,000 Chinese. I'll not use his verbiage from the line thereon. But he says, guess what? You guys can shoot in any direction. And that, of course, brought the house down. After we pulled out of Hagaruri, it was only 9 miles down to Kodori. That was the next Marine Corps stoppage. And we lost 600 Marines in that 9 miles. It was a tough trek out of there. But once I arrived there, I was the last of 3 Marines to approach Kodori, and there was a gunny sergeant standing there as a tech sergeant. And he said to me, he said, what's your rank? And I said, private, sir. And he said, well, you're now corporal. He said, take these 2 other Marines, and he says, I want you to take this half track over here. There are 4 DC-3s like we have out here there, full of wounded and deceased Marines. And he said, the Chinese have already secured the other end of the airstrip, and we need to give them some firepower to get off. And there's a 50 caliber machine gun on this half track. So we moved this half track down on one side, but while we were doing this, the first guy decided to take off without our support. The Chinese shot him down, and it was a horrible crash. They were all killed. But as I got there, this young lieutenant jumped out of his DC-3 and he said, follow me. Well, believe me, this guy was a track star from Stanford. I can't believe it. Thank God he was faster than me, because there was a Corsair sitting over there about 40 yards away. He ran over and jumped in it. And he hit the battery switch and the override, and thank God I came around the back of that aircraft, because there's 6 machine guns in the wings of that airplane, and they all went off. And he was really excited. He said, get your Marines over here. We're going to put this aircraft on the other side of this little strip, and we'll have 7 50 caliber guns to give these guys a chance to get off. Well, that's what we did. Just before 2 of them took off, and the third one, this young lieutenant who I panted after gave me one of these little things and called me over to the doors. There are no doors in these Looney Birds in those days. And he says, get your two buddies and get them over here and get in and climb on board. And I looked at him and I said, sir, I said, I'm sorry. I said, if we get on board, you won't make it out of here. Well, that was the first time in my life I'd seen an officer cry. He stood there and he saluted me and there was just tears running down his cheeks. He left and of course he wagged his wings and took off. Now, this is another significant emotional event. I am now in the Air Force 9 years later. I'm at Williams Air Force Base flying this beautiful machine you see right here. My name is on the other side of it. Although this is a later model, I flew the F model. And it's probably, I flew 34 different flying machines in my career, and that would be, on jets, that would be my number one. And my number two, of course, is the T-28, which is sitting outside. There's a little model here. I got to Williams Air Force Base, and I graduated number one in my class there. And I outshot everybody on the base in air-to-air gunnery. Well, the problem then, the Cold War was underway. And General Curtis LeVay was the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and also the Chief of SAC, Strategic Air Command. And we all hated SAC at that time, especially because we were fighter pilots. Well, what somebody on his staff decided was, the problem was Air Force pilot training classes, when they were graduating, the bottom one-third of the class was going into the back seats of B-47s. This is a B-47 sitting over here on the end. It's a 6-engine jet bomber built by Boeing, a marvelous machine once you got it in the air. But what happened was we all got frozen and we all went to SAC, and it was a horrible experience, just a terrible experience. The navigator and I met at McConnell Air Force Base for 3 months doing ground school in that aircraft and completing nuclear weapons school. Then we went down to Little Rock Air Force Base where I was flying, and we got down there, and of course the second day there, they said, well, you're going to fly 3 days from now, come in, we'll do a briefing. And we all sat in this briefing room for 7 hours, and at the end of 4 hours, I finally got up and I walked over to the instructor, the IP, and I said, excuse me, sir, I said, we've been here 4 hours. I said, what's the mission of the co-pilots? And he looked right at me and he said, son, the mission of the co-pilots is to listen to SAC talk. And I thought, oh my God, I got a college graduate and that's my mission, to listen to SAC talk? No wonder we hated SAC. In any event, we went out there. I got stuck in the fifth man seat, which is down in the bowels of that aircraft. Dark, you can't see anything. We flew for 7 hours. Fortunately, my buddy was up in the nose and he got really sick up there. When we landed, I walked into the wing squadron commander's office, ripped my Valco wings off, threw them on his desk and said, I refuse to fly this aircraft. Well, he tried his best to talk me out of it. I wouldn't give. So he finally said, okay, he said, you're going to get every detail I can come up with for the next 3 months. And of course I did. I painted all the squares outside, the parking lot. I painted the walls inside. I did everything you could think of. And of course I went up for my final check ride and I blew it. And we were the first crew to ever graduate from that school non-combat ready. And boy, did my squadron commander out here in March get word of me. As soon as I got there, he had me in a brace, and I hadn't been in a brace like that since the Marine Corps, and he was wandering around me with spittle flying out of his mouth, chewing me out, telling me he was going to 3912 me, which is a dishonorable discharge, because I was no good to the SAC. Well, he said he was going to give me every lousy job he could think of, and he did. And one morning he called me in and he says, Lieutenant, I want you to report Friday morning to the Officers Club. You're on the decorations committee for the Officers Wives Club party that night. So I did. And about 4 o'clock that afternoon, the squadron executive officer walked in, and he was in a blue uniform like this, Class A, and he walked around and he got 4 pitchers of beer, and there were 6 of us second lieutenants. He says, come on over here, guys, and sit down. I want to thank you for what you're doing. And so he said, I know 2 of you, but I don't know all of you. I want you to introduce yourselves, but I know this guy over here, Lieutenant Hunter. I don't even want to hear from him. So anyway, everybody went around and introduced themselves. Then this idiot second lieutenant sitting next to me said to this colonel, what are your merit badges for, Colonel? Well, you know, my protocol in the Marine Corps, you don't say things like that. If looks could kill, this guy was dead. And then in the second breath, he wanted to know what his top merit badge was. And this colonel, it took him quite a while to get himself composed. And he finally said, well, he said, it's for a distinguished flying cross that I was awarded for a flight during the Korean War. So everybody said, well, tell us about it. So he started talking, and I stood up, and I picked up my glass, and I said, Colonel, I'd like to make a toast. And again, boy, if looks could kill, I was really dead. I said, sir, I said, to the Marines left behind. And I gulped this beer and sat down, and he just stared at me because he couldn't figure out what I meant. And he started talking again, and I stood up again, and I said, Colonel, I said, I'd like to continue your story. And I picked up the story, and I didn't leave anything out. He stood up, walked around that table. I thought he was going to hit me, but he grabbed me, hugged me again, and he couldn't speak at first. He was so emotionally upset. But yeah, that was the same lieutenant that I met 9 years ago off that little airfield in Korea. So it was a very emotional event. He later became my mentor in the Air Force. I was ready to get out, but he was just incredible. He said to me, he wanted me to meet his wife that evening, and he wanted me in his office Monday morning at 8 o'clock. And of course, like I said, he became my mentor and turned my whole Air Force career around. I did fly B-47s for 6 years in the Air Force. It took 2,000 hours as an aircraft commander, or as a co-pilot, to upgrade to an aircraft commander. I upgraded with 400 hours. So I had a pretty good career in SAC, but I did not like SAC. The problem with SAC, the Cold War was probably the worst of the 3 wars I was involved in. Our schedule was 7 days locked up on alert, 7 days off, 7 days back on alert. This is underground. 7 off, then reflexing, flying to some secret base somewhere in the world surrounding Russia. And we had a bunch of them, and they were all classified for 59 days, and come back and repeat the same cycle. Believe me, the marriage record was really, the divorce record was terrible in SAC in those days. My final year there at Little Rock, I was physically gone from my home 304 days out of the year. So I wasn't really a lover of SAC. Once you got that airplane in the air, it was a great airplane. It still holds the world's international record for the most aircraft lost in flying training accidents. SAC lost 259 of them, plus their crews. The problem was it was designed by Boeing for 125,000 pounds gross weight. We were sitting on alert at 222,000. We had to have 30 JADO bottles to get us off the ground. And in that program you have, there's a picture of one, and that's got 30 JADO bottles on it. Well, the problem was SAC moved our training weights up to 198,000. All SAC runways are 13,000 feet long, and I can't tell you how many times I've gone down that runway, watched the 13,000 foot marker go by. I'm still on the ground, and all I can see is the overrun. And what you do is pop the wheel and bounce it in the air, and do a little praying, of course. Landing was the same way. The co-pilot, there was, I don't know, 7 or 9 fuel systems on the aircraft, and your landing speed was critical. And the co-pilot always figured it out depending on how much fuel you had on board. And if your landing speed was, your best flare speed was 131 and you dropped to 130, you're going to come out of the sky. And the problem is, when you came down, this had a bicycle landing gear. You'd hit the front gear first, it would compress and punch you up 100 feet, and from 0 to 100% on your throttles, it took 13 seconds before you got anything out of the engines. These were the first jet engines that the United States had. Well, you were going to be a ball of fire at the end of the runway. But once you got in the air, it was a great airplane. Now, I'm going to come to another significant emotional event. At Little Rock Air Force Base, I had a young lieutenant who was a good buddy of mine, 3 doors down from us on base housing, and his wife and my wife, we played bridge whenever we could get together. He was a personnel officer, and one day he called me up on alert, and he said, Dean, he said, SAC would not allow Air Force assignments to come on their bases because once they had you, they weren't going to let you go. He said, there's a classified message on my base. The Air Force wants fighter pilots to fly World War II prop fighters in foreign nations. He said, I'm going to lunch at 11 o'clock. I'll leave it on my desk. So I whipped up there and I looked at this message. I couldn't believe it. I was so excited. It took me about 45 minutes to fill out all the paperwork, and boy, I was really excited. 3 months went by, and I thought, oh well, I didn't make the cut. So I didn't think much about it, and I was on a final approach one day, a GCA ground controlled radar, And the operator said, Lieutenant, he said, monitor guard and call the command post. I did. And the command post said, the operator there said, Lieutenant, as soon as you land, report to the wing commander. Well, that's kind of like saying, go to the principal's office. You know, I queried my navigator and my co-pilot to see if they'd done anything wrong, and they said no. So I landed, jumped in my Jeep, and drove up there, and I was hot and smelly, and his secretary gave me a cup of coffee and ushered me into this room, and there was a major in there with the brand new wing commander. And for the next 45 minutes, we talked about fishing, weather, flying, and football. And back in the 70s, 67, well, late 60s, Lance Alderworth was an All-American running back at the University of Arkansas. And if there were 14 pages in the Arkansas Gazette, his picture was on 13 of them. So anyway, this guy asked me one question while we're talking along: would I be willing to fly a World War II propeller fighter in a foreign nation? And I said yes. And the conversation went on with fishing or something. And finally he said, I got one other question for you. He said, would you be willing to admit that you were not a member of the United States Air Force if you got shot down? Yeah, I didn't care. I wanted to fly fighters. I wanted out of there. So again, now 5 months went by, and I thought, well, I missed the whole cutoff. And again, same thing happened. I'm on final approach again, flying that monster, and the GCA operator said, you know, call the command post. I did. The command post this time said, Lieutenant, as soon as you land, report immediately to the wing commander. Well, that word immediately really got me. And again, I queried my crew. They hadn't done anything. And I thought, well, I knew the captain's list was on the base. Sure enough, when I got up there, the wing commander was really excited. He pinned my captain bars on, and he says, Captain Hunter, he says, I've got a message here in my safe. He said, like 26 years in the Air Force, I've never seen one like it. It's from the DIA. Well, I'd heard of the FBI and the CIA, but I wasn't aware of the DIA. So we had to get it out, and we both signed for it. And I had an airline ticket to Wichita, Kansas the next morning. And of course, I was sworn to secrecy. So I went home. My wife was used to me going on all these classified places anyway, so she didn't think too much about it. So I flew up to Wichita, got a taxi, went down to the train depot. I had a key to a locker down there. I opened the locker, and here was a train ticket to Blue Eye, Missouri. Now, I don't know how many of you are from Missouri in the audience, or if you've ever been there, but Blue Eye, Missouri consisted of a trading post, a gas station, and a Greyhound bus depot. And if there were 40 people there on Saturday night, that was really a group. In any event, I got there, and I had a set of orders, and I had a key, and I had to go to the Greyhound bus depot. And I opened the locker there. Here's a big manila envelope with Captain Hunter's name on it. I opened it up, and I had a ticket to Fort Walton Beach, Florida. And I'd never heard of that either. And I thought, you know, things like this didn't happen in the real Air Force. I mean, I'm a real Air Force officer. This happened to Steve Canyon and Terry and the Pirates, but not to us. So anyway, 18 hours later, I arrived down at Fort Walton Beach, and there was a young sergeant there, and he says, are you Captain Hunter? And I said, yes. He said, get in my Jeep. I said, okay. I said, where are we going? He said, we're going to Eglin Air Force Base. I said, well, what's going on at Eglin? He says, don't you know anything about Eglin? I said, no. He said, well, it's the largest Air Force installation in the United States. He said, there are 23 separate runways inside the confines of Eglin, and the CIA owns 9 of them. He said, you're going to Eglin 23, owned by the CIA. So in any event, I stayed there for a week and got a bunch of briefings, and then I went down to Hulbert, which is Eglin 9, and learned how to fly the T-28. And then again, I was on classified orders to APO 27. And I was the first draft there, and there were 6 of us on that draft. And so I said to these guys, I said, look, if you're going to anywhere in the South Pacific, you leave out of Travis Air Force Base in California. If you're going to Europe, you go to New Jersey. And I said, we're going somewhere in the South Pacific to APO 27, wherever that is. So I said, why don't you come in 3 days early, and we'll go to San Francisco to the south of the mark and party a little bit. They all agreed. So I got there 3 days early, and I checked into my BOQ room, and I walked upstairs, and I opened the door, and there was 2 beds in there, and on one of the posters was a Green Beret hat. Well, that was a time when that song, The Green Berets, was out, and I'd never met a real Green Beret, and I introduced myself to this young kid, His name was Carl Bradshaw, and he was going out that night, and I said, well, Carl, why don't you come with us? I said, I got 5 buddies coming in. We'll go have dinner and have a few drinks, and we'll get you on your airplane. Well, we got him inebriated. He missed his flight. And we said, well, why don't you come on with us to the top of the mark? I said, what the heck? You know, it can't be any worse. So we went to the top of the mark, and of course, the same thing happened. We missed our flight. Now we're back at Travis in the VOQ room and thinking, oh God, we're going to get court-martialed. And so I said to these guys, I said, well, let me go down to base ops, see if I can work something out. And I found this crew down there, mission planning, and I asked them, I said, where are you going? They said, Clark Air Base in the Philippines. So I walked over to this captain who was the aircraft commander, and I told him the truth. I said, here's what happened. I said, can you help us? He said, yeah. He said, go get your guys. He says, I can't guarantee you first class seating, but he says, I'll get you there. Because he said, that's where we're going. So I ran back, got him. We all climbed on this airplane and took off. And about 4 hours later, they lost the generator. We went into Hickam Air Force Base, and he said, look, we got to get ground rest for 8 hours. He said, you guys will just have to do something for 8 hours. I want you to know we went to the officers club and drank Mai Tais for 8 hours. I do not remember that flight going to Clark. In any event, we got to Clark, and we went to personnel, and we said, here's our orders, we're going to APO 27. And he said, this young clerk said, well, that's a classified place, I don't know where it is. So he went and got his master sergeant, he came back out and he says, look guys, he says, that's classified. He says, I'll send you down to 13th Air Force, they're 2 blocks down here, and they'll tell you where you're going. So we walked down there and we talked to this colonel, and he says, look, he says, guys, this is classified. He said, come back in 24 hours and I'll tell you where you're going. So we came back 24 hours later, we were sober. And he was really excited. He says, you're going to Vietnam. And we all looked at each other, and none of us were geography majors. We couldn't figure out where Vietnam was. And he said, well, he said, you know, it's about 500 or 600 miles south of us. And he said, it used to be called Cholon. That didn't ring a bell. And he used a couple other names that had gone over the names through the centuries. And finally he said, well, he said, Dien Bien Phu is there. So I raised my hand and I said, well, isn't that where somebody kicked the stuffings out of the French? He says, that's where you're going. So in any event, we got on a C-130 that night, and of course, got into Tan Son Nhut. The next day, I found myself 55 miles north of there at Benoit Air Base, which was the home of the 1st Air Commandos. And you know, when you check into any new outfit in the military, you always go through a whole line of signatures, signing your life away, etc., etc. And it wasn't any different there. When I got to the end, the young airman said, Captain Hunter, he says, you need to go down to the survival, these are all tents now, you need to go down to the survival tent and get your survival gear. And we had pallets between these tents because the mud was so bad. So I went down there and I found a little sign that said survival, and I walked in and there was a gunny in there, and I said, Gunny, I'm Captain Hunter, I need my survival gear. He said, well, he gave me a survival vest. He says, Captain, what do you want, a 45 or a 38? And I said, well, I carried a 45 in Korea and it saved my life. I said, I'll take a 45. So he slapped the 45 down on this bench, set 3 boxes of ammo there, stood back and put his hands on his hips. And I looked at him for about 10 seconds and I said, okay, Gunny, I give, what's wrong? He says, sir, we don't have any clips. And for those of you that don't understand a 45 automatic, you can't fire it with, that's what holds the bullets. So I said, okay, I said, I'll take a 38. So he picked up the 45 and picked up the 3 boxes, slapped the 38 down, stood back, put his hands on his hips again. And I looked at him again and I said, okay, Gunny, come on, this can't be true. And he says, yes, sir. He says, we don't have any ammunition for the 38. And I said, oh my God, what kind of a war am I getting into? But I had a 38 with me and I had 3 boxes of ammo, so I figured I'd be okay. Dress code in those days, I was detached from the Air Force to the CIA. I was working for an outfit called Bird and Son, which later became Air America and later became Continental Airlines. That's the CIA composure of it. In any event, we didn't have any. We could wear anything we wanted to as far as uniforms went. I've got to tell you a little bit about this T-28 here. This is a modified T-28 trainer right here. The one outside will not have the armament on it. But what the CIA did, they took this aircraft, which was a trainer for the Air Force, They took the 700 horsepower engine out of it and put a supercharged 1475 in there. And I want to tell you, it was really fun to fly. The problem was they didn't modify the firewall. The temperature in the cockpit was 150 degrees. And I know some of you have been to Vietnam, you know how hot it is and how moldy it is. A 2-hour flight was really tough in that machine, but it was an incredible, incredible flying machine. The only thing we had that identified us as members of this outfit was this Australian bush hat with a little thing on the side that says Air Commandos. We were all commandos by this time, bad guys. But there's one thing unusual about this hat. You'll notice that there's a band on here. That is a cobra skin band. Now, this is one of these mono-e-mono things in this outfit. You couldn't wear a cobra skin band on your hat. There's 24 pilots in the squadron until you got a bullet hole in your aircraft. Well, I want you to know I flew 69 combat missions. I would go out with a 4-shipper. 2 guys might get shot down and killed, and the other one with 7 to 8 bullet holes, and I didn't get a scratch. And finally, on my 70th mission, I told my bunkmate, I said, Hal, I said, when we come back from this mission today, I'm going to land about 4 clicks down here, take my 38 out and punch a couple holes in the tube. I can't take this anymore. Well, I got hit on that mission, and of course I got hit on every mission thereafter. But I did manage to get through 166 of them before I wore out my welcome there in Vietnam. And that was enough to make me want to get out of Vietnam. I had my section commander was gone when I got there. He was up at Da Nang, and about a week later he came down and he says, Captain, he says, you're going to have an in-country check ride before we can put you on the combat schedule. And he said, if you fail it, you're going to fly DC-3s or O-1s, Piper Cubs. And I looked at him and I said, Major, and I said, I'm a fighter pilot. I said, I'm not going to fly those things. He said, okay, then pass the check ride. Well, 3 days later, this young airman came running down and he says, Captain Hunter, report to the briefing tent to Colonel Adderhold. I said, okay. So I grabbed myself and I went down to the briefing tent, and there was only one full colonel in there, and I said, good afternoon, Colonel Adderhold. And he looked right at me and he says, Captain, my name is Heine. And I stood there for a couple of seconds. This has never happened to me. I said, yes, sir, Heine. He said, not yes, sir, and he said it that loud. I thought, wow. And so he said, do you have a checklist for your T-28? That's, every pilot has a checklist to tell you how to start the engines and all that sort of stuff. I said, yes, sir. He says, let me see it. I handed it to him and he threw it in the trash can. He said, here's your aircraft tail number and here's your combat frequency. I'll see you on the head in 7 minutes. And I thought, oh my God, I don't even know where the flight line is. I borrowed a bicycle and I got down there, and by the time I got down there, the colonel had already cranked up and taxied out. And I thought, what in the world, what kind of a check ride is this? Thank God the crew chief was really good. He got me seated, and we both started the engine, and he pulled the chocks, and I raced out to the end of the runway, and the colonel had already taken off. I was really mad at this point. This doesn't happen in professional airports. So I caught this baby, and it took me about 12 minutes to catch up to him. I finally pulled up on his right wing, and he said, he said, stay high and look out for ground fire. He winged over and went down and dropped 2 bombs, came back up and did the same thing again. Finally, he said, you're cleared in hot. Well, I really wanted to pass this check ride, so I thought, I'll press the target a little bit. And I did that. I went down and got my bombs pretty low, pulled up, and I looked back and there was nothing. And I thought, oh my God, what's wrong? And I looked at all the switches that I could think of in that, and I wasn't that familiar with the aircraft. Turned around and did the same thing again. The next thing I heard over the headphone was, it would help if you armed your weapons. You can imagine the feeling I had. I thought, oh God, I'm going to fly Goonie birds, you know. Well, I couldn't find the colonel. He took off. And of course, Vietnam, those of you that haven't been there, it's all jungle. There's no towns except Saigon, and that's a couple 100 miles away. And I flew around this target area for about 7 or 8 minutes, sweating profusely, thinking, God, where did the guy go? What heading did I fly down here on? And I finally selected a reciprocal, and I took off because I knew it was inland. And I flew for about 16, 17 minutes, and I was really getting scared. I went over to the tower frequency, and I heard this colonel give a gear check. So our radios were good for about 40 miles. I said, okay, it's got to be somewhere near me. So I started flying international triangles, which you do when you're lost. And on my second leg, I saw a Goonie bird out here on the horizon. And I whipped over there and pulled up on his left wing, went to guard channel and said, "Where are you guys going?" And the guy came back and said, "We're going to Benoit." And I said, "I'm your escort." The next day I was on the combat schedule. Anyway, that was my debut to Vietnam. Now, I couldn't talk about combat without mentioning superstition. I know some of you have probably heard me speak before, and I want you to know that fighter pilots will always tell you that they're not superstitious, and that's just a crock. They're probably the most superstitious guys in the world, and I'm no exception. Although my superstition is a little different. My superstition is about dates, and not the kind you eat. The date of June 25th has always been my date of infamy as long as I was in the Air Force. And let me explain why. June 25th, 1950, the Korean War started and I got an invitation. June 25th, 1951, 1 year later, I'm in a mountain containment area as a young private Marine, and about once a week a CIA, or pardon me, an OSS agent, which is a predecessor to the CIA, either a captain or a major, would come in our compound and he'd always say, where's your company commander, who was always a second lieutenant. And we all worked, and we all, of course, we wouldn't know what was going on. And he said, I've got a classified mission, I need 14 volunteers. Well, this is the second emotional event in my life. The entire troop stood up. And if you don't think that doesn't make you feel good about Marines, I mean, instead of him having to pick out 14 guys, everybody volunteered. Well, I was one of the 14. We went 18 miles behind the enemy lines, blew up a depot. On our way home, the North Koreans hit us on the side of a hill with mortars. A mortar round went off and killed the 2 Marines in front of me, the one behind me, and blew me over the side of this cliff. And they killed everybody else, desecrated their bodies, and took their weapons. And I woke up about, 7 or 8 hours later. It wasn't quite light yet, but I could hear the North Koreans up above me. So I just laid there. And then I lay there for 12 hours when it got daylight, because they were still up there. And that night I crawled out of there and I made my way back to Marine lines. The problem was our code word we had to get through our lines was negative now. And Marines have a tendency to shoot first and ask questions later. That was a tough time getting through there. The worst part of the whole thing was my mother got one of those infamous telegrams from our government saying, "We regret to inform you your son was killed in action." Well, that was June 25th, 1951. June 25th, 1952, I've now worked my way into the air wing. I'm on a Jeep carrier out in the North Yellow Sea. When Corsair, our pilots were flying Corsairs, but ours was outside, I guess. No, ours was hidden back over there. It's the Gull wing fighter. They were all World War II fighters, and of course they were getting a little old, and planes would go out a lot of times, and the ordnance wouldn't leave the aircraft because they get a shortened system. So a pilot would have to bring an aircraft back to the aircraft carrier with hung bombs. And he was dragging these weapons, and of course, it always wiped out his fuel load, and he was the last one to land. They always land 3 good ones first, and that poor guy was running on fumes. And what the Navy crews would take a cargo net 3/4 of the way down the aircraft carrier, it's about 3 feet high, and pull it across the carrier. And when the aircraft caught the hook, the bomb had come off, and of course, some of them were arms, but they'd skip down the deck and lodge into this net, and the EOD team would run out there and pick them up with a little tractor and drop them over the side. Well, we were supposed to leave the flight deck every time this happened, but you couldn't do it because too many things were going on. Well, one came in with 2 rockets, and the brackets were broken on the back, and they were hanging like this. And I watched this aircraft land, and every time, I don't know if you've ever seen an aircraft accident, but it always seems to happen in slow motion. These rockets came off, and they did a gainer and a half, and they collided and blew up. And they blew a hole 7 feet wide in the hangar deck, or the flight deck, and then 3 feet in the hangar deck, killed 14 Marines, blew me over the side of the carrier. And there's a catwalk around the carrier. On small Jeep carriers, it's cargo netting. On big carriers, it's metal. Well, I was in there for 18 hours before they found me. And again, my mother got one of those telegrams. So she had 2 of them now. That was June 25th, 1951. June 25th, I'm going to pardon me, that was 1952. June 25th, 1959, I'm now in the Air Force. I'm at March Air Force Base, my very first mission in the B-47. I'm flying with a crew I didn't know because I was trying to build up my flying time. The aircraft commander went out of his mind, tried to crash the aircraft. Fortunately, I was stronger than him. I wound up landing this aircraft, I should say dead sticking it. I became a glider pilot, but I was flying out of March Air Force Base and it was socked in, so I declared an emergency and went to Edwards Air Force Base because I knew there was 14 miles of runway on that Muroc dry lake. And I don't know where my engines quit, somewhere on final approach, but I dead stick that there. That was June 25th, 1959. 3 years later, I'm on my way to Europe at night in a B-47. I'm 140 some miles out over the North Atlantic in horrible weather. The tankers didn't show up. We were running low on fuel. Our alternate was Goose Bay, Labrador. And so we had to turn and come back through all this weather. And I was number 3, and I'm at 32,000 feet when my engines quit. So again, I became a glider pilot, and it was about 1.5 feet of snow on the runway at Goose Bay, but I got it on the ground. That was June 25th, 1959, where am I now? 59, yep. 2 years later, June 25th, 1961, I'm off the coast of Florida about 200 miles at night, and again, only one tanker showed up. The thunderstorms were up to 70,000 feet. And if you've never seen a thunderstorm that big, it's scary. The updrafts and the downdrafts inside there are 600 miles an hour. It's at night. I had 43 write-ups on this B-47. When I dropped off the tanker, the first thing that happened was my command radio dropped dead. I couldn't count out, but I could receive. I just couldn't send. But I could hear the lead aircraft telling the number 2, this is really a bad storm up here, turn left 5 degrees. So I cobbed this thing, and of course I went right into one of these things. And I went into, it popped me at 600 miles an hour, went straight up, flipped me over upside down, and everything that had been in that cockpit for the last 10 years was all over the cockpit, toffee tufts, you name it. And I finally got that aircraft inverted, but I over-controlled and I went into a spin the other way. And we recovered at 1,500 feet above the water. And of course, nobody in my crew could talk for 5 minutes. I told my navigator, I said, just give me a heading of 260 when we hit the Florida coast, we're punching out. But we managed to climb out of that. That was, let's see, 1962, 63, excuse me. Finally, 1 year later, I was coming back from another long-range mission, and I had all kinds of write-ups. And I was heading for Little Rock this time, and when I touched down, I was coming down too hard. The number 5 engine broke off, 5 and 6 engines broke off the wing and went trundling down the runway. And I bounced back up in the sky. When I came down the second time, the right-hand wing spar broke, and it went back about 50 degrees. And I did 3 ground loops before I finally got the thing stopped. And the only exciting thing that happened was I was scared. I told my navigator and co-pilot to get the heck out of this aircraft. I was afraid it was going to catch on fire. And a ladder banged against the side of the aircraft. And the squadron commander came up and he handed me a Bud Light and he says, "Hunter, you better get out of there." I did. That was June 25th again. The last one, June 25th, 1964. Of course, I was shot down on my final mission in Vietnam, and that had a tendency to spoil my whole day. That story is in my book there, by the way. People, after reading my book, will frequently ask me 2 questions. Number 1, why are you here? And number 2, what do you attribute it to? Well, on September 15th, 1950, I stepped ashore on the Incheon landing on the second wave with 4,300 Marines, and only 200 of us walked out of there. 8 years later, I helped start the Cold War while flying B-47 nuclear bombers. We were frequently penetrating the Russian air defense zone. We lost B-47s, but because they were nuclear bombers, the statistics are still classified. 5 years later in Vietnam, I was the 24th pilot in the squadron. 5 months later, there was only 4 of us left. And today there's only 1 of us left. So life is good. To answer the second question, what do I attribute the topic of my book to, since it came out of the Boy Scout manual, I want to share a story with you, and I'll be all done. This occurred, let's see, about 48 years ago. There were 4 of us still left alive. We were flying off of a jungle remote strip down in the bowels of the Delta area, and we'd flown 3 combat missions that day, and we were in our briefing tent that afternoon sitting there talking over what went right and what went wrong with our flights that day. And we were drinking a cold beer and just discussing these things, which you always do. And one of the things we had a problem with, Mr. McNamara would not allow us to fly an American flag. Now, we're 250 miles down in the Delta, and there's nothing but jungle around us. And who cares whether we've got a flag or not, but we cared. But if we flew an American flag, we'd get court-martialed. So one of the guys took a little 8x11, pinned it over our tent leg, and like football teams at bowl games, when they go down through those tunnels, they always touch those things. I'll guarantee you, we didn't fly unless we touched that American flag on our way out of the tent. That's how emotional it was. Well, what happened next was, for about maybe a minute and a half, each pilot explained what that flag meant to him. It was very solemn and very emotional. And then what happened next was what I call my final significant emotional event. The conversation went from the American flag to the Boy Scouts of America. And of the 4 survivors, 3 of us were Eagle Scouts. And I'll tell you, it just made what little hair I had stand straight up. And I want to carry this story one step further. I pinned my Eagle Scout badge on my son 31 years after I got it. And just last month, I flew to North Carolina and took it from my son and pinned that same badge on one of my grandsons. It was 70 years old. So I want to thank you for coming. I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. Hope I didn't bore you. My books are $15 a piece autographed, but if you want one, I'll guarantee you you'll enjoy it. Any questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned you were a lieutenant when you flew the C-47.
Yes, sir.
Weren't you a little young?
Well, not really. I was probably 27. Somewhere right around there.
I always heard that Strategic Air Command pilots were usually older.
They had a lot of problems inboard with pilots and crews. So they were taking fighter pilots right out of training.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'd like to know how you got from being a Marine to be an Air Force pilot.
Well, when I got out of the Marine Corps in November of '52, it's kind of a funny thing. I got discharged at Treasure Island, and you know, you go through a line, you sign all these forms, and there was a captain at the end of the line, and he said to me, I was a staff sergeant then. He said, "Sergeant, have you got anything to say?" And I said, "Yes, sir." I said, "If I could get anywhere near that SOB Truman, I'd kill him." And he said, "Would you take a seat right over here?" Well, they kept me there for 4 more weeks, and I had to go to psychological rehabilitation classes taught by 2 psychologists, women, who had never seen a gun. And I learned to keep my mouth shut. The reason I said that is because there's a thing called ROEs, Rules of Engagement. I'm sure some of you have heard of this. I discovered that they went all the way back to the Civil War, and I didn't know that. It comes right out of the president himself. He bypasses all the chiefs of staffs and everything else. Roosevelt in World War II decreed that all gunners on B-17s, B-24s were authorized 100 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition per mission. Well, they didn't pay any attention to it then because they didn't get court-martialed. In Korea, Truman authorized all riflemen 1 bandolier of ammunition a day. That's 72 rounds. The odds against us were 15-1 initially in the Korean War, later 200-1 when the Chinese entered the war. By the way, when the Chinese entered the war and fought us there at Hagaruri, I missed that, we were surrounded by 120,000 Chinese. 2 weeks later, they lost 60,000 troops, and we only lost 1,200. So that was a pretty good thing for the Marines. I hope I answered your question.
You still didn't tell me how you became an Air Force pilot from being a Marine.
Oh, okay. Well, I got to San Diego State, and one of my fraternity brothers' father was a senior vice president of the Bank of America. This was before computers. We We had 18 messenger routes around San Diego, and I went from one of my high school classmates had the best job of all. He was an air courier for the Bank of America. He flew 5 nights a week between San Diego and Los Angeles carrying classified material for the bank. I bought the job from him. One night I had an old lady, I had an epileptic fit on the aircraft, and I remembered from my Boy Scout training, you know, just to take a spoon and hold her tongue down. That's all I did. And my picture was in the San Diego Union 2 days later. And about a month later, I met Mr. Patterson, who was the president of the United Airlines in Los Angeles. And he said, "Son, what are you going to do when you graduate?" I already changed my major 2 or 3 times. He said, "Well, the 707s are just rolling off the assembly lines. We can't get multi-jet qualified pilots. If I get in the Air Force and get 300 hours, he guaranteed me a job in writing." He did. I still got the letter. So that night I went out and sat with the 2 pilots in the little jump street, and I said to them, "How long does it take to get from the flight engineer seat over to the co-pilot seat?" And they said 11 to 15 years. And I said, "Oh my gosh." Then I said, "How much money do you guys make?" Next morning I was in the ROTC office with my right hand up. That's how I got in. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Can you tell us about your final flight in Vietnam?
Oh, that'd take too long. It's in my book. It's a Silver Star flight. It was a classified flight. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't get the Silver Star until 4 months after I left Vietnam. I got it in Okinawa. And all I got was the unclassified version, which doesn't tell you much about what went on. About 5 years ago, a colonel called me from Fallbrook and said that he was doing research on awards and decorations for the first 2 years of the Vietnam War, and he noticed that I was the 22nd recipient of the Silver Star. And I said, "So?" He said, "Well, you realize you were the first living one." And I said, "So?" He said, "Well, do you know what you did?" And I said, "No." I said, "All I got is the unclassified version." So he said, "Well, would I mind if you contacted Air Force and got a copy of the write-up?" 5 months later, he said, "Can I come down and have lunch with you?" Well, to make a long story short, I was given credit for killing 400 Viet Cong in one day and saving the lives of 38 Americans underground, Special Forces. That's basically it in a nutshell. That's why I'm in with you. Anything else? I'd be happy to autograph the book for you, and thank you for coming. Hope I didn't bore you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Hunter.